The unexpected knock. It was one of those nights where everything felt routine, predictable, even dull. The week had been long, filled with work, meetings, and obligations that drained my energy. Now that the weekend had arrived, I wanted nothing more than a quiet night to unwind. A few drinks, some music, and maybe a little company. Nothing serious. I sat on my couch, scrolling through my phone, debating whether I should go out or stay in. The idea of a loud bar with endless chatter and artificial smiles didn't appeal to me. What I wanted was simple: someone to talk to, someone to share a few hours of laughter with. No strings, no expectations. I sighed, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen across the room. Maybe I was just feeling lonely. Maybe that was the real reason why I decided to pull out my phone and send a message. It wasn't the first time I had used this service, and it probably wouldn't be the last. A few quick texts, a polite exchange of details, and within minutes, the arrangement was set. "She'll be there in an hour. Have fun," the final message read. I leaned back, feeling a rush of anticipation. It wasn't excitement, not really, just a temporary distraction from the monotony of my routine. I poured myself a drink, letting the ice clink against the glass as I took a slow sip. The warmth of the whiskey spread through my chest, relaxing me as I settled in for what I expected to be a simple, uncomplicated night. But then, the doorbell rang. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was exactly on time. My pulse quickened just a little. Strange. Usually they were either early or late, never right on the dot. Setting my drink down, I made my way to the door. The anticipation was familiar but fleeting, just another part of the process. As I reached for the handle, I exhaled, preparing to greet a stranger with a practiced smile. The door swung open, and my entire world stopped. Standing in front of me, dressed in a casual yet elegant outfit, was not the woman I had been expecting. It was someone else entirely. Mrs. Henderson, my best friend's mother. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I had misread the messages. Maybe this was some kind of bizarre mistake. But no, she was standing right there, her expression calm yet unreadable, her lips slightly curved into a soft, knowing smile. "Hello, Michael," she said, her voice smooth and composed. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Mrs. Henderson." I stammered. What are you doing here?" She tilted her head slightly, studying my reaction as if she had anticipated my shock. "I was just in the neighborhood," she replied casually. "Thought I'd check in on you. It's been a while." My thoughts raced, struggling to piece together an explanation for why she was at my doorstep. Of all places, Mrs. Henderson wasn't just any woman. She was Tom's mother, Tom, my best friend since childhood. She was the woman who had welcomed me into their home countless times, who had always been warm and kind, who had never, in all the years I had known her, given me any reason to expect this moment. My heart pounded against my ribs. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. The unspoken weight of the situation settled between us. I wanted to ask her again why she was here, why she had come to my home at this hour, but the words stuck in my throat. She smiled a little wider, but there was something in her eyes, something different, something I couldn't place. "Are you going to invite me in?" she asked, her voice light, almost teasing. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that I should say no, that I should close the door and pretend this never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside. "Sure. Come in." She entered without hesitation, moving past me with an air of quiet confidence. I closed the door, exhaling sharply as I tried to gather my thoughts. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. Mrs. Henderson made herself comfortable on my couch, crossing her legs gracefully as she glanced around my living room. The familiarity of her presence unsettled me. "You live alone now, right?" she asked, her tone casual. I nodded. "Yeah, moved in a few months ago." She smiled, as if she already knew that. "It suits you," I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I settled for a nod, still struggling to understand what was happening. She turned her gaze to me, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. "You seem surprised to see me." I let out a nervous chuckle. "Well, yeah. It's not every day my best friend's mom shows up at my door unannounced." She arched an eyebrow. "Would you prefer I leave?" The way she asked the question, so direct, so calm, made me pause. I should have said yes. I should have ended this before it got any weirder. But I didn't. "No," I said finally. "You just caught me off guard." She nodded as if she understood, then leaned back against the couch, her posture relaxed. "It's been a long time since we talked, Michael. I just thought it might be nice to catch up." Something about the way she said that sent a shiver down my spine. I cleared my throat, desperate to shake off the tension. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Wine?" "No, thank you," she replied smoothly. "I won't be staying long." The words should have reassured me. They didn't. I sat across from her, feeling like I was in some kind of alternate reality where nothing made sense. My mind screamed for an explanation, but she wasn't offering one. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "Michael," she said softly, her voice carrying something deeper, something that wasn't just casual conversation anymore. "I've been meaning to ask you something." A chill ran down my spine. "What is it?" She hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again, her voice quieter, almost a whisper. "Are you happy?" I frowned, caught off guard. "What?" She leaned back again, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to answer right away. Just think about it." I didn't know what she was getting at, but something told me this conversation was far from over. And for the first time that night, I realized this was only the beginning. The weight of unspoken words. The air in my living room felt heavier than it should have. The quiet hum of the city outside my window was the only sound that filled the tense silence between us. Mrs. Henderson, Tom's mother, sat comfortably on my couch, her posture relaxed, yet her presence felt anything but casual. I had expected a simple night, maybe some drinks, maybe some company, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I sat across from her, my mind spinning in circles, trying to make sense of why she was here, why she had chosen tonight, of all nights, to show up at my door. And more importantly, why did it feel like she had something more to say? She had asked me a question, one that had caught me completely off guard. "Are you happy?" A simple question, an innocent question, but coming from her, at this time, in this setting, it felt like it carried the weight of something much deeper. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied her face, searching for any clue as to why she had asked it. There was something different in her eyes, something I had never noticed before. A softness, maybe, or perhaps a sadness. Finally, I cleared my throat, forcing a small chuckle. "That's a pretty loaded question, Mrs. Henderson." She tilted her head slightly, watching me closely. "Is it?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "I mean, happiness is complicated, right? Some days are better than others." She nodded slowly, as if she already knew what my answer would be. "That's fair." A long pause stretched between us. I had so many questions. Why was she here? Why was she asking me something so personal? What was she really trying to say? But for some reason, I hesitated to ask. There was something about the way she looked at me, like she was waiting for me to figure it out myself. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling. "All right, I'll bite. Why do you ask?" She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of the wine glass she hadn't touched. "Because I wonder sometimes if people are truly as happy as they seem." I let out another dry chuckle. "Well, I don't know about other people, but me. I get by." She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "Getting by isn't the same as being happy, Michael." Her words settled over me like a weight, and for the first time, I realized that this conversation wasn't just small talk. She wasn't here to make casual conversation. There was something more, something personal. "Okay," I said, meeting her gaze. "Then what about you? Are you happy?" Something flickered across her face, something fleeting, but unmistakable. Regret. She inhaled sharply, looking away for a moment before answering. "Happiness and I have a complicated relationship." I frowned slightly, not expecting such an honest response. Before I could say anything, she continued. "When I was younger, I thought happiness was something you could chase, something you could find if you just looked hard enough. But as I got older, I realized it's not that simple." She turned her gaze back to me, and for the first time that night, she looked vulnerable. "Sometimes, happiness is something you have to create for yourself, even if it means making choices other people wouldn't understand." Her words sent a chill down my spine. There was something in her voice, something unspoken, but heavy, something she wasn't saying. I shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean by that?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're a smart man, Michael. I think you already know." I swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. The way she was looking at me, it was like she was daring me to understand, to connect the dots. But my mind refused to believe the conclusion it was forming. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just here to check in on me. She wasn't just here for casual conversation. She was here because something in her life had reached a breaking point. And somehow, I was a part of it. The weight of the moment. The room felt smaller now. The air between us was charged with something I couldn't define. For years, I had known Mrs. Henderson as my best friend's mother, a kind, warm, responsible woman who had always been polite, always been distant in the way adults were when they spoke to their children's friends. She had always been composed, always had everything together. But the woman sitting in front of me now, she wasn't the same woman I had known all those years. She was someone else. Someone with secrets. Someone who, for some reason, had chosen this night, this moment, to let me see a side of her that no one else had. I felt my pulse quicken. I needed to change the subject before this went too far. "So Tom's doing well," I said quickly, hoping to lighten the mood. Mrs. Henderson studied me for a moment before nodding. "Yes, he is." "He talks about you a lot," I added, forcing a smile. "Says you still check up on him too much." That made her chuckle, though there was still something distant in her expression. Mothers never stop worrying, even when they should. I nodded, not knowing what to say. Another silence fell between us. This time, it was her who broke it. "Michael," she said softly, her voice lower than before. "Can I ask you something?" I tensed slightly, unsure of what was coming next. "Of course." She hesitated, as if debating whether or not to say what was on her mind. Then, finally, she spoke. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like you're living a life that isn't really yours?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. I started, then stopped. Did I feel stuck? Had I ever felt like I was just going through the motions, waiting for something, anything, to shake me out of my routine? Before I could answer, she leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. I asked because I know what it feels like. I studied her carefully. She wasn't just talking about me. She was talking about herself. And suddenly, I realized something. Mrs. Henderson, Tom's mother, the woman who had always seemed so put together, so in control, was trapped. Trapped in a life she no longer wanted. And she had come here to me because she needed to escape. My mouth went dry. I had been expecting someone tonight. But not her. Never her. And now, I had no idea what was about to happen next. A crossroad of choices. The weight of the moment pressed down on me. I should have ended this conversation. I should have stood up, thanked her for stopping by, and sent her on her way. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, staring into the eyes of a woman who, for the first time in her life, Looked like she was on the verge of making a decision that couldn't be undone. And the terrifying thing was, so was I. She shifted slightly, her fingers lightly gripping the fabric of her dress. "I don't know why I came here tonight," she admitted. "Maybe I was looking for an excuse. Maybe I just wanted to feel like myself again, even if just for a moment." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mrs. Henderson." She looked at me. "Michael," she corrected softly. And just like that, something shifted. Something that couldn't be taken back. Something that neither of us could pretend hadn't just happened. I had a choice. End this, or let it happen. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know what I was going to do. The line we cannot cross. The weight of silence between us felt suffocating. The walls of my living room seemed closer now, as if they had shrunk under the intensity of the moment. The clock on the wall ticked in agonizing slowness, each second stretching longer than the last. Mrs. Henderson, Tom's mother, sat across from me, her hands delicately clasped on her lap, her posture still composed, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet storm, a silent confession waiting to be spoken. She had come here tonight for a reason, and I had a feeling she wasn't going to leave until it was acknowledged. "Michael," she said again, this time softer. "What are you thinking?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't know what to say. How could I? The unspoken tension between us was something I had never prepared myself to deal with. This was Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had scolded me and Tom for breaking a window in his backyard when we were kids. The woman who had fed us dinner when we played video games too late at his house. The woman I had never, not once, thought of this way. Until tonight. I had a choice to make, and no matter what I chose, everything would change. A dangerous question. I cleared my throat, buying time. "I'm thinking. I don't know what's happening here." She smiled faintly. "Neither do I." Another silence. I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on my knees. "Mrs. Henderson, why are you really here?" She met my gaze, her expression unreadable. "I could ask you the same thing." That threw me off. She was the one who came here, not me. I frowned. "I didn't come looking for whatever this is. You showed up at my door." She nodded, as if she already knew I'd say that. "And you let me in." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, I did." Her gaze didn't waver. "Why?" That single word, "why?" felt heavier than it should have. I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I didn't have an answer I wanted to admit. Because the truth was, the moment I saw her standing at my door, a part of me didn't want to send her away. A part of me had been curious, intrigued, drawn to whatever this was, even if I didn't understand it. And that part of me, it terrified me. I shook my head. "I don't know." She leaned back, watching me, studying me. I could feel the weight of her stare, feel it pulling at something inside me that I wasn't ready to confront. "Michael," she said after a long moment, her voice quieter, more vulnerable. "I need to be honest with you." My pulse quickened. "Okay." She exhaled slowly. "I don't belong in my life anymore." The words hit like a thunderclap. I blinked. "What?" She smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. The kind that carried years of unspoken truths. For a long time, I felt like I'm living a life that doesn't feel like mine. Like I'm just existing. And tonight, I didn't want to feel that way. I swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. "Mrs. Henderson." She shook her head. "Call me Elena." I froze. Elena. She had never asked me to call her by her first name before. Not once. And now, suddenly, she was asking this. Everything inside me screamed that this was dangerous. That this was a line we could not cross. That if I let this happen, if I let her into my world in this way, there would be no going back. The power of a name. I hesitated, but finally, I nodded. "Elena." She smiled softly, as if she had just won some silent battle. That wasn't so hard, was it? I let out a dry chuckle. I guess not. Another pause. She looked down at her hands, fingers running absent-mindedly over the hem of her dress. I've made mistakes, Michael. More than I can count. I frowned. What kind of mistakes? She hesitated. The kind that make you look in the mirror and wonder if you recognize the person staring back at you. I studied her carefully. Are you talking about your marriage? She inhaled sharply, like I had struck a nerve. Yes. Among other things. I didn't push. I knew enough to realize that this, whatever she was going through, was bigger than me. She continued. People assume that just because you're married, you're happy. That having a house, a family, a husband, means you're fulfilled. But the truth is, sometimes the loneliest place to be is right next to someone who doesn't see you anymore. I felt my jaw tighten. There was pain in her voice, a deep, aching pain. And I hated the way it made my chest feel too tight. I exhaled. Does Tom know? She shook her head. No, and he can't. He thinks I have everything together. He thinks I'm strong. Maybe you should tell him the truth, I said softly. She let out a small, humorless laugh. And then what? Watch him look at me with pity. Watch him feel guilty for not noticing sooner. She shook her head. No, that's not what I want. I swallowed hard. Then, what do you want? Her eyes met mine again. And for the first time that night, I saw it. Not just sadness, not just regret, but desire. A forbidden kind of desire. A kind of desire that should not exist between us. And yet, it did. I sucked in a sharp breath, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. Elena. She reached out. Just barely. Her fingertips brushed against my knee. A touch so light, so hesitant, I almost thought I imagined it. But I hadn't. She had touched me. And suddenly, everything changed. A choice we cannot undo. I shot up from the couch, heart pounding, chest tight. I think you should go. She looked up at me, unfazed. Do you want me to? Do you want me to? The question lingered in the air, twisting itself around my lungs, refusing to let me breathe. I should want her to leave. I should be ending this right now. But the truth, the terrifying, dangerous, unforgivable truth. I didn't want her to go. I didn't want to end this. I wanted to know where this would go. I wanted to know what it would feel like if we stopped pretending. If we let this happen. If we crossed that final, irreversible line. She stood up slowly, taking a single step closer. The air between us was electric, humming with something neither of us wanted to name. Tell me to leave, she whispered. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I couldn't say it. I could not tell her to leave. Because I didn't want her to. And she knew it. She stepped closer. Michael. Her voice was soft. So soft. And so very, very dangerous. I knew in that moment that this was the moment everything would change. That whatever choice I made next would be the choice that defined the rest of my life. And for the first time ever, I didn't know what I was going to do. The threshold we cannot uncross. There are moments in life where time slows down, not in the poetic sense, not in some romanticized metaphor about cherishing fleeting seconds, but in the way that every muscle in your body tightens, every breath becomes deliberate, and every choice you make feels as though it carries the weight of the universe itself. This was one of those moments. Elena, Mrs. Henderson, stood just inches from me, her presence sending ripples through the very fabric of my reality. I could feel the warmth of her skin in the air between us, the way her breath was just slightly uneven, like she was caught in the same storm I was. She was too close for this to be innocent, too close for this to be a mistake, too close for this to be something we could forget. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, her dark eyes filled with something raw, something unguarded. "Michael," she whispered. "Say it." I swallowed hard. "Say what?" "Tell me you don't want this." I opened my mouth. I should have said it. I should have. But I didn't. Because it would have been a lie. Instead, silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, filling every space that words should have occupied. The air itself felt charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Anticipation, danger, inevitability, all colliding at once. Then she did something that shattered every last bit of control I had left. She reached out, her fingers trailing down my arm. Slowly, hesitantly, as if testing whether or not I would pull away. I didn't. I should have. But I didn't. I felt the warmth of her touch seeping into my skin, a dangerous invitation, a silent confession of everything we both already knew. She let out a quiet breath. "You feel it too, don't you?" I clenched my jaw. Elena. Her name felt foreign on my tongue, like something forbidden, something I shouldn't be allowed to say. She gave me a sad, knowing smile. "You don't have to fight it." "I do," I muttered, forcing myself to take a step back. "Because if I don't, I won't stop." Her expression didn't change. She had already known what my answer was before I even said it. "You're afraid," she murmured. "Yes." Her eyes softened. "So am I." And that was the problem, wasn't it? This wasn't just some reckless impulse. This wasn't just about attraction. This was about two people standing at the edge of something they had no business approaching. A line that, once crossed, could never be undone. She exhaled slowly, stepping back, giving me space I desperately needed. I should go. I nodded. "Yeah, you should." Neither of us moved. The seconds ticked by, stretching into eternity. Then, finally, she turned toward the door. But as her fingers curled around the handle, she hesitated. "I meant what I said before," she whispered, not turning to look at me. "I don't belong in my life anymore." My throat tightened. Before I could respond, she opened the door and stepped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows beyond my doorway. And just like that, she was gone. But the moment, the weight of what had just happened, that wasn't going anywhere. A storm I can't ignore. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Not as Tom's mom. Not as the woman who had been in my life since childhood. But as Elena. As someone who had walked into my home and changed something inside of me. Something I wasn't ready to confront. I kept replaying the way she had looked at me, the way she had hesitated at my door, the way her fingers had brushed against my arm, as if she had been afraid I'd pull away. But I hadn't. I had let it happen. Because deep down, I had wanted it to. I sighed, running a hand over my face, my mind a storm of emotions I couldn't name. I needed clarity. I needed air. But most of all, I needed to see her again. A decision I can't take back. The next evening, after an entire day spent pretending I wasn't thinking about her, I found myself standing in front of her house. I told myself I wouldn't come. That it was wrong. That it would only make things worse. But my feet had carried me here anyway. I stood at her doorstep, my heart hammering against my ribs, my fingers hovering just inches from the doorbell. What was I even doing? This was insane. If Tom ever found out. No. I shook the thought away. This wasn't about Tom. This wasn't about anyone else. This was about her. And me. Before I could change my mind, I knocked. Once. Twice. The sound echoed into the night. Seconds passed. Then the door creaked open. And there she was. Barefoot, dressed in a loose sweater and leggings, her hair slightly tousled, her eyes widening slightly when she saw me. We stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. The unspoken truth between us was louder than anything we could have said. I swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" She nodded, stepping aside. And just like that, I crossed the threshold. And there was no going back. A confession we cannot ignore. The moment I stepped inside, everything felt different. Not just the air, not just the setting, but us. Elena closed the door behind me, her fingers lingering on the handle as if she was considering locking it. She didn't. Instead, she turned to me, her gaze unreadable. "I didn't think you'd come," she admitted. I let out a small, humorless laugh. "Neither did I." She studied me for a long moment. "Then why are you here?" I exhaled. "Because I can't stop thinking about last night." She didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, she stepped closer. "I can't either," she whispered. I clenched my fists. "This is wrong." She nodded. "I know. We shouldn't do this." Another nod. "I know." Silence. A silence filled with everything we weren't saying. Then, she moved first. One step, then another, until she was standing just close enough that I could feel her warmth. She hesitated, searching my face for something, anything, that would tell her to stop. I didn't. I couldn't. I should have. But instead, I reached for her, and the second my hands touched her, the world fell away. The line we have now crossed. I didn't know how it happened. I didn't know who moved first, who closed the final distance. But suddenly, her lips were on mine, and every single reason why this was wrong ceased to matter. Her hands gripped the front of my shirt, pulling me closer, her breath shaky, desperate. I pressed her against the nearest wall, my body moving before my mind could catch up. There was no hesitation. No second guessing, no regret, only us, only this. And as we fell into the inevitable, I knew one thing for certain. There was no undoing this. We had crossed the line, and nothing would ever be the same again. The line we have now crossed. The moment her lips met mine, the last remnants of hesitation burned away. This wasn't supposed to happen. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. And now, there was no turning back. Her fingers clutched at my shirt, gripping tightly as though afraid that if she let go, reality would come crashing down around us. My hands found their way to her waist, hesitating only for a second before pulling her closer. She let out a soft, almost involuntary breath against my lips, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The air in the room grew hotter, heavier, filled with something unspoken but undeniable. For the first time, this wasn't Mrs. Henderson. She wasn't Tom's mom. She was Elena. And I was Michael. Not her son's best friend. Not some boy she had watched grow up. Just a man. A man who had fallen into something he could no longer control. My hands ran up the curve of her back, feeling the heat of her skin through the soft fabric of her sweater. She arched into me slightly, responding with a quiet intensity that made my pulse thunder in my ears. Every part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to think, to walk away, to pretend this never happened. But my body wasn't listening. She wasn't stopping either. Her lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency it felt both reckless and necessary, as if she had been waiting for this, for me, for longer than she would ever admit, and maybe in some unspoken way, I had been waiting too. Then, suddenly, she pulled back. We were both breathing hard, our foreheads nearly touching, the air between us thick with something we couldn't name. I searched her face for hesitation, for doubt, for some sign that she regretted what had just happened. But all I saw was want. She reached up, tracing her fingers lightly along my jaw, her touch feather-light, almost hesitant. "Michael," she whispered, my name lingering between us like a dangerous secret. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "This is insane," I muttered. She let out a soft, breathy laugh, but there was no humor in it, only something bittersweet. "I know. We can't do this," I said, forcing myself to say the words even though every fiber of my being was screaming for the opposite. "I know," she repeated. And yet, neither of us moved. Neither of us stepped away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her fingers still resting against my skin. "But tell me you don't want this." Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. I opened my mouth, paused, closed it, because I couldn't say it. She exhaled sharply, as if she had already known my answer. "Then what are we supposed to do?" she murmured. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think, trying to process. "Elena, this doesn't just go away. If we do this, it means something." Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. "I know," she admitted. "And maybe that's why I'm scared." I sighed, resting my forehead against hers. "Me too." A beat of silence. Then, finally, she took a step back, just enough to put space between us. Space we desperately needed. "I should stop this," she whispered. I nodded. "Yeah." Neither of us moved. Then, she turned away, hugging her arms around herself as if suddenly aware of just how wrong this was. "Michael, She hesitated. "I didn't come here tonight expecting this." I let out a bitter chuckle. "You think I did?" She glanced at me, her eyes filled with so many conflicting emotions: fear, longing, guilt, desire. "What are we doing?" she asked, almost to herself. I exhaled, making a mistake. A long pause. Then, finally, she nodded, as if forcing herself to accept the truth. I should go. The word sent a sharp, unexpected pang through my chest. I should have agreed. I should have let her leave. Instead, I asked, "Do you want to?" She froze. Her hands tightened around the hem of her sweater. Her breathing hitched. "Michael, do you want to go?" I repeated, my voice quieter this time. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look at me, her eyes burning with something that made my stomach twist. And then, just like before, she closed the distance between us. Her lips met mine again. But this time, it wasn't hesitant. It wasn't uncertain. It was inevitable. A choice that cannot be undone. The night blurred after that. Everything became a series of moments, stolen between breaths, between hushed confessions and unspoken truths. The weight of everything. The years of knowing her as Tom's mom. The silent barrier that had existed between us before tonight. It all shattered. Somewhere between the whispers of her name against my lips and the feel of her fingers gripping my skin, I knew that we had crossed a boundary that could never be rebuilt. She wasn't the same woman who had raised my best friend. I wasn't the same boy who had grown up in her home. We were something else now. Something dangerous. Something that couldn't be undone. The morning after, I woke up before her. The sunlight was filtering through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. My body ached in the best possible way, a lingering reminder of the choice we had made last night. For a few seconds, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. Then, I turned. Elena was still asleep beside me. Her hair was slightly messy, her breathing steady, her face softer, more peaceful than I had ever seen it. She looked real in a way she never had before. Not just as Mrs. Henderson, not just as Tom's mom, but as Elena. And I wanted her. More than I should have. More than I had any right to. But as I stared at her, a knot twisted in my stomach, because reality was already creeping back in. And this, what we had done, it wasn't something we could just ignore. It wasn't something we could pretend never happened. The weight of it all settled heavily on my chest. What the hell had we done? A future we cannot predict. As if sensing my gaze, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, she just blinked sleepily, adjusting to the light. Then, as realization hit, her expression shifted. She turned to me. We stared at each other. Neither of us spoke. Because what could we possibly say? This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't something we could undo. It was a choice we had both made. And now, we had to live with it. Finally, she exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael." I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. And that was when I knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. The fallout of forbidden desire. The morning sunlight felt like an accusation. As it streamed through the curtains, illuminating the quiet room, every golden beam seemed to whisper the same question. What have you done? I lay still, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in a slow, heavy rhythm. My mind replayed the night before in vivid detail, the heat of her skin against mine, the quiet gasps between kisses, the way her body had melted against me as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. For the first time, I had seen Alina as more than just Tom's mom. She was Alina, a woman who had been yearning for something real, something that made her feel alive. And last night, she had found it in me. But now the morning had arrived, and the reality of what we had done was unavoidable. Beside me, she stirred. I turned my head to look at her. Her long hair was tousled from sleep, her face soft, her lips slightly parted. The sunlight danced across her bare shoulder, tracing delicate patterns across her skin. She looked peaceful, vulnerable, beautiful. But when her eyes fluttered open, reality crashed down around us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other. And in that silence, everything was said. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a mistake that could be erased. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Finally, she inhaled sharply, breaking the silence. Michael. Her voice was raw, hesitant. I swallowed. Yeah. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her, as if suddenly aware of just how real this was. Her fingers trembled as they brushed through her hair. What happens now? The question hit like a thunderclap. What did happen now? We couldn't go back to the way things were. That much was obvious. But we couldn't exactly move forward, either. Everything about this was wrong, wasn't it? I exhaled, running a hand over my face. I don't know. She let out a shaky laugh. Me neither. A heavy silence fell between us again. This was the moment. This was when we should have stopped. This was when we should have agreed to never let this happen again. But instead, she reached for my hand. And I let her. Her fingers curled around mine, hesitant yet firm, like she was holding onto something she wasn't ready to let go of. Michael, she hesitated. Do you regret it? The question nearly knocked the breath out of me. I should have said yes. I should have told her that this was a mistake, that we needed to forget it ever happened, that we could never, ever, let it happen again. But instead, I found myself shaking my head. No, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't. She let out a breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. Neither do I. That should have scared me. It should have terrified me. Because if neither of us regretted it, then what was stopping us from doing it again? The weight of what we are. We spent the next hour in silence. She got dressed. So did I. There were no rushed goodbyes, no frantic scrambling to undo what had already been done. Instead, we moved around each other carefully, as if testing whether the connection between us had changed now that the heat of the night had cooled. It hadn't. If anything, it was stronger. She stood by the door, her fingers lightly gripping the handle. She didn't open it. Not yet. Michael, she said softly, turning to look at me. I braced myself. Yeah. She hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke. This wasn't supposed to happen. I nodded. I know. But it did. Yeah. A pause. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, and I don't want it to be the last time. The confession sent a jolt through my body. I took a step closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. Alina. I know, she interrupted, shaking her head. I know how wrong this is. I know how complicated it will be. But, she exhaled, as if struggling to put her emotions into words. For the first time in a long time, I felt something last night, and I don't want to lose that. I clenched my jaw. Neither did I. But saying it out loud, that would make it real. That would mean accepting what we were doing, and what we were doing was dangerous. I forced myself to take a breath. This is a mistake. She nodded. I know. But neither of us moved. Neither of us meant it. She reached for the door. This time, she opened it. I should go, she said. I swallowed hard. Yeah. She hesitated, her gaze locked onto mine. But I'll see you again. I should have said no. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I nodded. And just like that, she was gone. But the fire she had ignited, that wasn't going anywhere. And I already knew. This was only the beginning. The secret we now share. The next few days passed in a blur. Every moment felt like a disconnect, like I was existing in two separate worlds. In one world, I was just Michael, Tom's best friend, the same guy I had always been. In the other, I was something else, something I couldn't define. And the weight of that secret hung over me like a storm cloud. Tom called me once, just to catch up. I tried to act normal, tried to pretend everything was the same. But it wasn't, because every time he spoke, every time he mentioned his mom, I felt like I was keeping something from him. Something that, if he ever found out, would destroy everything. And yet, I couldn't stop. Because every night since that first night, I had been waiting. Waiting for her call. Waiting for the next time we would see each other. Waiting for the next mistake. And then, one night, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it immediately, my heart pounding. Unknown number. I need to see you. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't have to ask who it was. I already knew. And in that moment, I made my choice. I grabbed my keys. And I left. A future we cannot escape. When I arrived, she was already waiting. She stood in the dim glow of her front porch, her arms crossed, her eyes searching mine as I stepped out of the car. I walked toward her slowly, the night air thick with unspoken words. "Elena," I started. She silenced me with a look. Then, before I could say anything else, she reached for me. And just like that, we fell into each other again. There was no stopping it now. Not anymore. Because this was inevitable. And no matter how wrong it was, neither of us wanted to stop. Not now. Not ever. The edge of the cliff. If there was ever a moment where I could have walked away, where we could have both pretended that what happened between us was a mistake and gone back to our separate lives, it was gone. Vanished. Burned to ashes by the heat of her touch, the weight of her breath against my skin, the way her fingers trembled as they reached for me in the dark. By the time I stepped through her doorway, I had already crossed the final threshold. There was no going back now. The night that changes everything. The door closed behind us with a quiet click, sealing us inside a world where only we existed. The outside world. Tom, my past, her responsibilities, the weight of our choices, none of it mattered in that moment. It was just her. Just me. Just this undeniable pull that neither of us could fight anymore. "Elena." My voice was hoarse, unsteady. She silenced me with a look. Not with words. Not with hesitation. With certainty. Then she kissed me. And the second her lips met mine, every thought of right and wrong disappeared. There was no logic here. No careful deliberation. Only feeling. Only desire. Only the raw, unshakable truth that whatever had ignited between us was bigger than either of us could control. And so I let myself fall. I let myself be consumed, her hands fisted in my shirt, pulling me closer as if trying to erase every inch of space between us. My fingers traced the curve of her spine, committing every detail to memory. The warmth of her skin, the way she shuddered at my touch, the way her breath hitched when I whispered her name. Elena. A name I had never spoken like this before, a name that felt dangerous on my lips, and yet I never wanted to stop saying it. She led me through the dimly lit house, down familiar hallways that I had walked so many times before. But this time, it was different. This time, every step felt forbidden, every moment stolen. By the time we reached her bedroom, the reality of what we were doing was irreversible. There was no stopping. Not anymore. Not when she looked at me like that. Not when her hands pulled me against her with such desperation. Not when we both knew that we had already lost the battle. The world blurred. The night swallowed us whole. And in the quiet, tangled sheets of forbidden desire, we became something neither of us could walk away from. The morning after, the moment of truth. When I woke up, I knew everything had changed. The soft glow of early morning light crept through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. The air was thick with warmth, with the quiet aftermath of the night before. And beside me, Elena. Her body was curled slightly, one arm draped over my chest, her breathing steady and peaceful. I lay there, unmoving, staring at the ceiling as my heart hammered in my chest. Last time, I had woken up confused. This time, I woke up certain that whatever this was, it wasn't ending here. Carefully, I turned my head to look at her. She was still asleep, her face relaxed in the stillness of the morning. A lock of dark hair had fallen across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed it away. She stirred at the touch, her eyelashes fluttering slightly before she opened her eyes. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. No words, no regret, just understanding. Then she whispered, "You're still here." I swallowed hard. Yeah. A pause. Then, "Are you okay?" The way she asked it, the way her voice carried something fragile, something almost fearful, made my chest ache. I reached for her hand, intertwining our fingers. "I am," I said softly. "Are you?" She exhaled, her lips curving into a small, almost relieved smile. "I think so." Silence stretched between us. And then, reality came crashing down. Her phone buzzed from the nightstand. The sound shattered the fragile illusion we had built in the quiet of the morning. Elena tensed. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Tom, her son, my best friend, the one person who could never, ever find out about this. The weight of what we had done slammed into me all at once. "What the hell are we doing?" Elena closed her eyes, exhaling slowly before reaching for her phone. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, finally, she silenced it. Didn't answer. Didn't move. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, her breath coming in slow, uneven beats. I sat up slightly, resting my head in my hands. This is bad." She let out a hollow laugh. "You think?" I glanced at her. "Elena, we can't keep doing this." She turned to face me, something unreadable in her expression. "Then tell me you don't want to." I opened my mouth, paused, because I couldn't say it, because it would have been a lie. She sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself. "I know this is complicated. I know it's messy. But Michael, last night wasn't just some mistake. It meant something, didn't it?" I clenched my jaw. "Of course it did." She swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized something. We had already fallen. There was no undoing it. No pretending it hadn't happened. No erasing the way we had felt in each other's arms. There was only one choice left. Either we ran from it, or we faced it. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "We figure it out," I said quietly. Her eyes searched mine. "Together." I nodded. "Together." And in that moment I knew. This wasn't ending here. Not now. Not ever. We had crossed the line. And there was no turning back. The future we cannot escape. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments. Soft touches in the dark. Lingering glances when no one was watching. Secret meetings that should have never happened. But they did. because we couldn't stop, because we didn't want to. But deep down, we both knew this wouldn't stay a secret forever. Eventually, the truth would come out, and when it did, the fallout would be unforgivable. But for now, all that mattered was us, and the dangerous, undeniable truth that we had already fallen too far to turn back. Because some things aren't meant to be ignored. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And some desires, they are simply too powerful to deny, no matter the cost.